Hello, Dr. Schindler. Thanks for accepting the invitation to come on my channel and discuss metaphysics. I uh, published a book, as most of my readers will know recently, and in the book, I make use of several of your ideas, um, and I wanted to explore some of them in more depth with you. And also, there's a few things that I just hint at in the book that I didn't want to go into like too much further in the book because it's not necessary for the scope of the book, which is just helping people get out of the meaning crisis. But I think there's a few things that are still relevant for people who are more interested, let's say, in the symbolic world metaphysics. So yes, maybe I could let you introduce yourself a little bit for the readers, listeners who might not be
Sure.
aware of you and your work.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation. I received a copy of your book, and I am very supportive of your aim and your topic, and have been looking forward to discussing some of it with you. So, my name is David Schindler. I go by DC Schindler in print, and I am a professor of metaphysics and anthropology, philosophical anthropology, at the John Paul II Institute, which is in Washington, D.C. at on the campus here at Catholic University. In my areas of thought, I'm a Catholic. I guess that should be obvious. And I work among theologians, but my work is in philosophy. I got my PhD here at Catholic University, and I'm especially interested in the classical tradition, especially the Neoplatonic tradition, but not exclusively. And then the use of traditional thought in contemporary Catholic philosophy and philosophy more generally. So I focus just as it happens, often on the Greeks and the Germans, probably especially. But again, I'm sort of a generalist, interested in anything really philosophical. So thanks for having me on your show.
Perfect. I heard about your work a few years ago through John Vervaeke. I think he started recommending your works, like mainly Plato's Critique of Impure Reason at the beginning. I think that's the first thing I read from you, and then also I don't remember which one I read next, but The Catholicity of Reason had a big impact. I found it very powerful to explain. I don't think I would have understood Balthazar. Well, I don't understand all of Balthazar, obviously, but at least the idea of how the world comes to exist through God's love, and
Mhm.
this same idea in Dionysius, I don't think I would have understood it like nearly as quickly, let's say, or even just at all, without that book. I recommend it to lots of people, by the way. Um, but
Thank you.
one thing in particular that I'd like to dig into is a move I make in the book to try to use this idea of the world coming to exist through love to solve a problem in analytic philosophy of mind. Well, really, in analytic philosophy of physics, more widely, let's say, but it's often used in philosophy of mind. So, I'm gonna summarize it a little bit, and then I'd be curious to know if you've heard if you've heard of people trying to do something like this, if you have reservations, if it works, if it doesn't, or also like if there's other relationships between, let's say, your work or Balthazar's work and physics. I haven't seen a lot from what I saw looking through the literature, but I'd be curious. So anyway,
Sure.
I'll start more with the argument. So in philosophy of mind, in analytic philosophy of mind specifically, there's lots of people trying to work on the hard problem of consciousness these days.
Mhm. Yeah.
Um, and then in parallel, in the philosophy of physics, lots of people have noted that the ontology of physics is really empty if you look at it, because physics only describes its entities extrinsically. It tells you like what are equations we can use to describe the behavior of certain things, but you never get at anything deeper than behavior. Um,
Right. Right.
so, like a common objection that people will have is, okay, maybe I don't know what the electron is right now because it's true that if I try to describe the electron, I have a mass and a charge, but like a mass and a charge just mean that if I plug these constants in equations, I can get this output, but it doesn't really tell me what the electron is. And even
Yeah.
if one day I could discover that electrons are made of particles X and Y, let's say, the argument would just happen at that layer instead of X and Y, and then the electron will also be only known extrinsically if it's just a combination of things known extrinsically. So that's a point that is commonly made now in philosophy of physics, philosophy of mind. It dates at least back to Russell, who made it pretty clearly. Um, so there's this problem in the ontology of physics. And on the opposite side of the spectrum in analytic philosophy of mind, at least, people try to find a place for mind in their ontology because people feel pretty confident they can describe how things happen in the world through the language of physics, even if they can't like do it in detail, at least in principle, everything could be
Hmm.
describable using equations. Um,
Right.
so there's this mapping that's very tempting that lots of people like to do. Okay, like we have alls in physics, let's say, in our ontology, and then we have mind that we're trying to fit. So we're just going to put mind in the in that ontological void in physics.
Yeah.
Um, and this is the reason why lots of people are moving to panpsychism these days in philosophy of
Mhm.
mind.
Mhm.
And on the analytic side of philosophy of mind, I should say, don't think I've seen anything close like I don't think I've seen anything like this in the continental branch of
Mhm.
philosophy. Correct me if I'm wrong, though. You know this branch more than I do.
Uh, j- Working specifically on like panpsychism.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
There are some places I'm not up on the current work in this area, but I do know that there's a resurgence of interest in things like Neoplatonic philosophy, and there's um, uh, the idea is certainly not foreign.
Hmm.
Maybe a particular area is work on Schelling, the German philosopher Schelling. He promoted something like panpsychism, and his star is on the rise in some
Okay,
some of the more obscure corners of continental philosophy. Sure.
okay, okay. That's interesting. I don't know as much about this branch, but
Mhm.
I know that in like the analytic side, it's gaining traction, and but there are some problems with it. Obviously, like there's the famous combination problem. It's really hard to describe how consciousnesses would combine. Let's say that electrons are conscious to some extent, and protons and neutrons too, and then they combine
Mhm.
into an atom. Like, what's the consciousness of that atom? Or if
Yeah.
my cells are all conscious in some way, how does that combine into my consciousness? That's hard to explain.
Yes.
And also, if you have independent arguments for the existence of forms and also for the existence of potential, it's tricky to talk about the existence of potential because it's not a, like formal kind of existence. But
Right.
um, still, like if you acknowledge that these two extremes exist within
Yeah.
creation, it's hard to talk about consciousness of like just an abstract form or
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
potential.
Right.
So what I try to do in the book is instead to talk about love as the
Mhm.
fundamental nature of things.
Mhm.
Um, you can get there in a number of ways. Like you can start with an argument that's more strictly philosophical, like let's say you've seen Dionysius of
Mhm.
like how the world can exist being distinct and yet united with
Right.
God. And then when you have this, you can explain how like the fact that the higher level of existence exists doesn't negate the existence of the lower layers. The higher layers will rather open up space for the emergence of the lower layers.
Yeah.
So that means you can have this cascade of love that creates things bottom up and top down. Uh,
Mhm.
so I find that an attractive move, and also I like the fact that it's direct as a solution to the both the ontological void of physics and the art problem of consciousness. I think that's why panpsychism is popular these days. It solves like an existential problem for people. Like if your mind doesn't fit in your ontology, that's a big problem. And
Yeah. Of course. Yeah.
so there's that, and you can also get there from psychology.
Mhm.
Things that Balthazar was saying decades ago, but now we see people like John Vervaeke making that argument in cognitive science as well, that human beings come to exist through the love of their parents. It's the
Yeah.
way that our consciousness is formed is because we love our parents when we're kids, but we're just in a chaotic state of potential, and it's through the love of our parents who observe us and form that chaos into something coherent that we come to be rational and to exist as people. And
Yeah.
that love doesn't negate us. It's because our parents want us to be independent that they love us this way. And it, paradoxically, it's because we become independent that we can truly love them and become actually closer to them. So So this
Right.
solves a lot of problems.
Yeah.
But I was wondering what you thought about this kind of argument, and in general, what more, let's say, you've seen about the relationship between your thought, Balthazar's thought, or Dionysius' thought, and physics, these kinds of arguments.
Yeah. I mean, the huge point. This we one could spend the rest of one's life on precisely these topics. So what I say I fear is going to be a bit superficial, but maybe through our interaction we can draw some things out. But just to begin, first of all, the that kind of positivism that you mention in science is a really striking reality. um, there was a book published many years ago by Edwin Burt called "The Metaphysics of Modern Science," and he draws out some very fascinating texts at the very beginning of the scientific revolution. More or less begins with the decision with Galileo to say we have spent we've wasted so much time trying to understand what gravity is. Let's forget that question and simply attend to what it does, measure it. And so that was, I mean, that in a way is the founding notion. This is really at the very beginning. And the problem is, initially, he didn't take that to be. He took that to be setting aside understanding the natural world, and we're just going to open up the possibility of a kind of pragmatic engagement with things. But it's interesting, over the centuries we cease to understand the difference between those 2 points, and we in fact begin to substitute this mechanistic sort of predictive and ultimately therefore technological approach to science as an understanding of the natural world. And then, as a in reaction to that, we have this. It's precisely a kind of reactive introduction of spiritual dimensions or religious dimensions to complement what we concede as a description of the material world. And so it has created a real mess because you have those who are concerned about a materialist reduction who think that the way out of materialist reduction is by insisting on something other than matter. But and again, what happens is you're conceding a reductive sense of matter, and then you're adding something to it from the outside. And it seems to me the most radical response has to be a rethinking, a recovery of the true meaning of matter, first of all, and within a richer sense of what matter is. You don't need to invent a god of the gaps. You don't need to, in a way, um, um, limit the scope of science in order to introduce these deeper dimensions, because the deeper dimensions become a kind of natural element of science itself. So my approach to these questions is always that we need to expand the meaning of science rather than reduce it. And it's by expanding the meaning of science that we actually can engage more fruitfully with these philosophical and theological discussions. So that's one thing. In terms of and it sounds to me that what you have envisioned with love as a I mean, it's precisely one of the central ways of doing precisely that. I think it's a potentially quite fruitful. The key term, to my mind, and it's become increasingly evident how the importance of it is the term analogy. To understand consciousness as analogical, to understand love as analogical. What does that mean? That means that um, if you say something like, cells have um, a certain rudimentary expression of consciousness. If you don't have an analogical sense, you run into what you call the hard problem there. You've got all these conscious cells, and how do they add up to another? It's a very different thing if you think of consciousness as analogical. They're not conscious in the proper sense, but they're what the kind of order that they represent is analogous to consciousness, so that precisely in its integration in a larger whole, it can give rise to something that would properly be called conscious. so that they're connected, but they're not the same thing that would ever enter into any kind of competitive relationship. And it seems to me that that's a way of thinking of things like the panpsychism. If panpsychism means that everything is conscious, then it seems to me that's clearly problematic in a certain way. But if you say that um, that there's one universe, and therefore there's no reality in the universe that's absolutely different from everything else, so that um, revelations of higher types of being actually tell us something about the lowest types and vice versa. It seems to me that's a much more fruitful way of approaching the question.
Yeah, I'd like to go back to your earlier point. And I'd be because I'd be curious to know how it's a more common it is for people now to take that kind of reframing option where
Mm-hmm.
they like are willing to reconsider the foundations of science
Yeah.
and enlarge them, being more open to metaphysics as well in general. Because there's always been people who have been advocating for this, like all the way through the science revolution. The scientific revolution, you can see there were philosophers and theologians who were insisting that okay, like we're confusing a model for the reality of the thing, but like we're always gonna need to go through a human filter through
Yeah.
like to go through that model. But we forget that we need the human and that we're only dealing with a model. And
Yes.
people were always harping on this. You can always find someone saying this.
Yeah.
And I get the sense, I'm not sure, like it's just the sense, but I get the sense that I see more arguments now coming out of academia of people being aware of this. And like I think it was just in like some more, I don't know, obscure parts of philosophy that you used to see this. I think now it's more common in philosophy, even analytic philosophy.
Right. Right.
Um, and then,
That's
yeah,
happening in many areas in science, in politics, in I mean economics. It's in that sense we're living at a very exciting time. These things are entering into the mainstream. The problem is, as they enter into the mainstream, they often start to take oversimplified forms that become problematic. But it's such a hopeful situation that people, in fact, want to ask these really fundamental questions about these basic human activities. I'm very happy to see it.
yeah, and that's a good segue to another thing I wanted to talk with you about. A move that some people have been making is a kind of return to idealism.
Hmm.
People notice that human consciousness plays a role in like realizing things to some extent.
Right.
Like in cognitive science, it's become very mainstream, and even outside of cognitive science now, it's pretty well like it's getting more and more known that the world is too complex for us to just like perceive it like simply as a collection of facts. We need to to ignore a lot of things. We need to
Mhm.
condense the things that remain into just a few simpler forms and concepts. Well, simpler by simpler,
Relevance
yeah.
realization, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
and I think even just in like in politics, it's becoming more obvious to see that people need to like collapse the multitude of facts down into narratives that they can actually yield in their own lives, and people can live in very different worlds because they don't do that narratization the same way. Um,
Yeah.
so I think
Yeah.
it's becoming more and more known that human consciousness plays a role in constituting and realizing the real.
Reality.
Yeah.
Yes.
So it's good that this is happening, but as you said, as it's becoming more popular, one thing that I've observed, especially when things are going, especially when things are more negative, I'd say.
Yeah.
So in this was especially obvious to me during COVID because I was the editor of the Symbolic World blog at the time. I still do it for the French version and I still contribute in English, but I used to receive everything that people submitted in English. And I could see there was a time when I could see people understanding this idea that, okay, the world comes to exist through human consciousness, but I could see some people who like went a bit too far. I'd say like if you it seems that if you don't have the idea that it's through love, more than just mind in general, mind is a bit large of a
Right.
concept.
Right. Right.
if you talk about love and attention as what like realizes reality, then you can explain that what exists outside of human consciousness is not completely like pure potential or pure nothing. Like we don't if we attend correctly with love to the things that are around us, then we don't negate their reality outside of us. We do
Right.
bring them up higher,
Yeah.
but they still exist to an extent. Like when Adam was naming the animals, let's say, he's bringing them up higher when he's naming them and bringing them into human level patterns
Yeah.
that they couldn't get to on their own. But like when he was naming an animal, he wasn't naming nothing. He wasn't naming pure matter. Like,
Right.
and
Oh, absolutely. No, absolutely. And that's why, I mean, that's why I shy away from any sense of idealism. I think that's problematic in all sorts of ways. First of all, it's just a reactionary sort of flip side of the problem. So it's not really getting to the heart of things. It just sort of reverses it. But the traditional view that you've mentioned, if you look at Dionysius, this the special role that man has in the traditional context is the result of a symbolic, properly understood, a symbolic cosmos that is rooted in the idea of God as absolute goodness. So generosity and therefore love, goodness and beauty is at the origin of things, and that's why this the cascading that you mentioned down is not a dissipation of what is pure only above, so that the dissipation so that there's nothing that you have at the lower levels. So I know some people interpret it this way. There's nothing at the lower level that you don't have better at the level above and up and up. And so in a certain sense you wonder, well, why is there a cosmos at all? And it seems to me that if you begin with a radical sense of goodness, and then especially and here, the Christian appropriation of this idea really does transform it. You transform it with a sense of the Trinity and the sense of the Incarnation, and these dimensions become absolutely unmistakable. That the descent is genuinely creative, so that in this wildly paradoxical sense, even though there's nothing below that doesn't come from above, when it arrives below, it's more than simply a more sort of diffuse expression of what's higher. It's actually, there's something more that then what's higher than the higher levels can actually then receive. And so you have now this possibility of a reciprocity that's certainly not clear in idealism, and I think it tends to be less clear in non-Christian interpretations of Neoplatonism.
yeah, one thing I can say too to one to go back just a few minutes. Like what I saw, especially during COVID, with people turning to idealism, especially when things are negative around them,
Yeah,
is I saw lots of people get into like bad spirals of meaning around them.
yeah,
Like if it's like they don't give enough reality to the things outside of them and to the feedback they might receive from the world. And then like I could see people who saw negative patterns happening around us in politics or closer to their lives. And it's easy to do when there's like a crisis around.
sure.
But then what would happen is it would become kind of self-fulfilling prophecy where if you like attend to negative things and you're not willing to acknowledge that there are good things like in the world out there, you'll only see the negative things. They will affect you negatively, so you'll see more negative things, and people get
Right.
into bad spirals of meaning. Um,
Absolutely.
and some people, I saw some things that were almost like schizophrenic. Like it was a sketchy period of time. I think it got better because of the politics, but I'm not totally sure that in terms of the public understanding of a metaphysics of love has like really seeped into the culture yet. I think we're still in this dialectic of materialism and idealism, by and large. Um, but yeah, that's the point I wanted to wrap up with. But another thing I
Yeah,
want,
there
go
is. I mean, just to comment on that, I mean, that's a very important insight, and it is extraordinary how self-reinforcing this pattern can be. And it's the problem is that it's always going to be founded on something that's true, And so it will always seem to be able to justify itself. And this is one of G.K. Chesterton's insights. These this kind of schizophrenia, or this absolutized paranoia. It's not that it lacks reason, as he says. It's the problem is it hasn't lost reason. It's lost everything but reason. And there's a real truth to that. So it's not so much pointing out that what a person says is false. You need to kind of reorient a person to see in a kind of a bigger way that expands the heart. And in that moment you suddenly uh affirm the same truths. You see the bad things, but they're now part of a larger picture. And so that you get perspective, quite literally. They're put in perspective, and that's what a healthy psyche looks like.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good point. Um, Bouncing back on something you mentioned earlier of like loving the lower layers of reality. It's more of a curiosity. I don't know how much bearing it has concretely, like on deeper philosophical points, but with this reframing of science and realizing the
Hmm.
fact that we use models to understand the world, one thing
Hmm.
I see some people doing, I see some Aristotelians doing this, for
Yeah,
instance, um, like they insist on the fact that we use models in science, and that the further away we get from direct human experience, the less we can trust those models. And then
yeah,
what I see some people doing is like going to the point of saying that by the time you get to, let's say, fundamental physics, you can't really trust anything. Like you don't really know, like what of these things are real, what of these things are like useful fictions. Um,
right.
I personally tend to grant a lot of reality to electrons. Like I don't think physics can tell us what the nature of electrons really is, but I think it has identified things that do exist. And
Yeah, yeah.
in the metaphysics of love, I
You
tend
know,
to like
yeah.
what?
If I may say, I do electrons exist? I mean,
Mhm.
that's actually a really interesting question, and maybe I'm falling into the problem that you're concerned about. But I would say it seems to me that uh, if by existence we mean our substances in the classical metaphysical sense, which is something that has its own existence in itself. It stands on its own and is the foundation for various accidents and so forth. Um, I It raises a question. I mean, for the most part, electrons don't exist as you and I exist. So I mean that's precisely why they're fundamental particles. But there is something. Analogy really helps here. You might say they exist in an analogous sense, and this is why, because if they exist if they simply exist, then any given thing is nothing but a collection of electrons. But if you recognize that they exist in an analogous sense, you can say they have a kind of relative reality, but their reality only actually makes sense in a concrete whole. And it's really in as part of a concrete whole that they um, bear on the world in a kind of. And this it's interesting. I know that there have been some physicists, and this is sort of beyond my pay grade, as they say, but that want to try to use some of the more classical concepts of potency and actuality, potency and act, as a way of understanding the relationship. The something like the quantum, the collapse of the wave function and that kind of thing, which I find very interesting, and potentially it seems to me very fruitful. But I probably know just enough about that to get myself in trouble. Uh,
Yeah, it's I do talk about that kind of stuff a little bit in the book. When the analogy point I think is interesting because would you say the same, let's say, of a human
mhm.
needing to exist within larger groups? Let's say if you weren't in like a member of your family, like would you
Mhm.
still like how would you exist? Do you think?
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's excellent. Yeah, but see, there you see how supple the notion of analogy is. It doesn't mean that every part whole relationship is going to look exactly. It's going to follow the same law. So it's not the case that I only partially exist and I only really exist in the family. There's a certain sense in which, um, and this is a classical. perspective that I would want to qualify, and it's something I'm hoping, down the line. I've got notes in a notebook, and one of these days I'm going to work this out in some detail. So I do want to qualify it, uh, basically I would affirm a classical view that says something like, there is something about a human being that represents a kind of completion of existence as a substance, and things that are lower are are increasingly analogous extensions in one direction, but then that also goes up higher. So
Hmm.
there's a sense in which a family is a reality that's a whole greater than the sum of its parts, but it's not a reality in the same sense that I'm a reality in relation to my electrons or my
Hmm.
cells or whatever.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um, yeah, but I think it's helpful to see that, because I do learn something about, there is a continuity, so that's not just difference. And so I do learn something about the relationship between electrons and a molecule that would be uh, by learning something about the relationship between an individual and his family.
Yeah, yeah. That yeah,
Yeah.
that makes sense. So if I try to summarize, like you,
Mhm.
and I think that's something that Jonathan would explicitly get behind with. I think it's fairly common in Christianity to see man as a kind of summit of reality that mediates like all other entities, like bigger or smaller.
Yeah.
So like the so within creation, you'd say like the summit of existence is man. But then
Within, yeah, depend. So
yeah.
within material creation.
Oh, yeah, okay, okay. Yeah.
Yeah, because you do in the classical view, they're hierarchy of angels that are in way higher, but not as central.
Hmm.
No, that I mean that's to say that man has a central existence is
Yeah, yeah.
precisely not to say he's at the summit.
Yeah, 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 yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, fair point. And then like around man, you'd say like bigger and smaller entities are analogous,
yeah,
a lower kind of existence. They're mediated through man in a way.
right,
Yeah.
right.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. No, I find Ferdinand Ulrich, this German philosopher who died a few years ago, just incredibly helpful. I mean, I say that with some trepidation because his writing is so dense and
Yeah.
difficult, but insofar as one grasps it, it's incredibly illuminating on this point that even that the Mary ultimately, the yes to the incarnation, which is in a way the most complete affirmation of the integration of spirit and matter, body and soul, in a way that is also on behalf of the angels. It's not just on behalf of the subhuman creatures, but it is sort of on behalf of all creatures in the cosmos. I mean, that's really quite a stunning vision. One would have to say a lot to defend it and lay it all out, but just as an idea, I think one can see it's really a stunning view of things.
Yeah. Your commentary
That
on
has
Ulrich is very useful, by the way. I tried to read the original. I really
yeah,
struggled. I don't think I finished it. I think your
yeah,
commentary was very useful.
yeah. But there's some. I'm working on revising a translation with one of my students. Of We just published three short works in one volume of his, which are much more accessible. And then we're doing one now on his life in the unity of life and death, which is really a phenomenal book, and that should be done by next year. It'll be out next year.
I'll be looking forward to it. Maybe another point I thought about to see if we're on the same track.
Mhm.
Let's say that we go. So we talked straight away about electrons, but if we go something a bit
Yeah,
closer to man, but still lower than us,
yeah,
let's say cells.
yeah,
There's there is a sense in which cells don't exist like outside of the organism that
yeah.
like is the all of them.
Right.
There's so many interconnections between cells that like if you try to just like take one and like get it out of the organism, it's gonna
Yeah,
wither and die like and not be a cell like very quickly.
yeah,
And I suppose like analogically that's gonna keep going the lower you go down the hierarchy that um,
yeah.
things exist as like insofar as they're part of
A
the
being. Yeah,
form. Yeah.
yeah. Right, right. That's exactly right. Yeah, and it's interesting that then that you know our usual way of thinking then would want to absorb them into the higher level, but that's not the case. I mean, there's a way in which, that's true, but there's also a way that we then reciprocally depend on ourselves, and even cells of things that are not us, like the, microbiome,
Yeah.
that the various bacteria that are their own little beings, that are we have increasingly come to understand how important they are for our life activities. I mean, that's extraordinary to think that these basic acts of life. So this kind of connects with your love theory. It's there's a kind of reciprocity, a very curious reciprocity between us and our gut bacteria,
Yeah.
for instance, that benefits both us and the gut bacteria.
Yeah. 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 And I find it hard to articulate this like very succinctly, but in the metaphysics of love, because you don't like I want to sort of have the advantages both of materialism and idealism of thinking
Hmm.
that okay, I do think that physics gets at something that exists when it's talking about the electron because
Yeah,
the predictions worked well, the math is
yeah,
great. Like there's I think that they've hit on something real, but it's also true that you can't take it in isolation from something bigger. It's a part of like in idealism. But I want to live in that tension, let's say.
yeah. Oh, I do too. Yeah. When I say doesn't exist, I don't mean just pure fabrications of the mind. I just want to say they exist, in the same way that potency in relation to act.
Yeah.
It's not that potency doesn't exist, but it does. It has a kind of purely relative existence, even though it bears then on actuality. I mean, it introduces its own limitations and constraints and things that shape the actuality. So, and I would say something similar. So there's they're real, even if they aren't existing things of themselves.
Yeah.
Something like that's how.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
but
good.
I think we're basically on the same. Yeah,
Yeah, that's good. I wanted to check though. I wanted to check because
yeah, yeah.
this idea is still very dear to me because I did before studying philosophy, I did math and computer science and a lot of physics on the side, and it's still like something I love, and I don't I don't want to lose it. Let's say,
No, no, please don't. If I may just put a plug in, especially now. I mean, there are so few people that understand both the mathematical kind of dimensions and are attentive to the metaphysics. You usually do one or the other, and then those people have difficulty speaking to each other. It's really precious to combine those. So I want to encourage you very much to develop these things.
perfect. Still continuing on that thread, I'd like to discuss something. As I mentioned earlier, it's not something I go like deeply on in the book because it's not central to recovering Christian metaphysics,
Mhm.
at least insofar as just getting out of the meaning crisis, which is the goal of the book. But this idea of man being central and material creation being mediated through him
Yeah.
is related to idealism that we talked about earlier. I see lots of people coming to this kind of view in the symbolic world community,
Mhm. Mhm.
like the spirals of negative meaning that we talked about earlier. I did see also related to the idea that the world comes to exist through human consciousness. I think it's tied to people seeing it a little bit too idealistically, but
Mhm.
still like it. Again like brings up the fact that we need to be careful about how we talk about like human mediation of
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
existence of the material world. Um, and there's a number of arguments that I've seen people make. Jonathan talks about how the world exists through Christ.
Mhm.
You can see obviously instances of this in scripture.
Yeah.
There's an American scholar, Jordan Daniel Wood, published a book a few years ago stating,
Maximus.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
that you see this in Maximus. And so this kind of idea is coming to the fore more,
Yeah.
and I think it's important to get it right. And so I saw I was gonna say Schindler. I saw Balthazar uh, do that. I think in Love and the Postmodern Predicament, there's a section where he seems to be
That's
stating.
my book. Wait,
Sorry.
that's not
Oh,
Balthazar.
that's funny. That's funny.
Maybe Love Alone, you're
Yeah, yeah,
thinking of?
exactly. Yeah, yeah. That you translated. Yeah, yeah. So I quote a section of that in the book to that effect where he seems to want to say that let's say the greatest act of love was the crucifixion, and that as the greatest act of love, it's the mediator of the layers we said earlier between God and creation. Um, so wanted to check with you if that's how you saw it as well.
Absolutely. I mean, I would affirm that and then complement it with a couple of points because I think it's really crucial that we recognize the crucifixion as being a kind of paradigmatic act of love that also reveals the other paradigmatic act of love, which is creation. It's really important not to isolate creation from redemption or redemption from creation. I think that's a really crucial um, that redemption is a recreation in a way, renewal of creation, and the creation itself already has a kind of a yearning openness to redemption, so that the radical character of the um, uh, of redemption, in a certain sense, shows us that um, uh, everything was already given in the act of creation. And then another dimension of this so you have the theological and then you have the metaphysical, which would be the metaphysics of creation. But then I would also add the anthropological specifically, and I think that I'm coming more and more to understand that so many of these discussions that you've been pointing to, one of the crucial questions at the heart of it is what's the relationship between the body and soul in the human being, and how do we both, what is it in itself essentially, and how do we enact that relationship in the our various activities of life. I think is really really important, and I'm increasingly coming to see the role of the heart in the relationship between body and soul. That's this is very recent for me, but it's becoming a kind of a fruitful point. So I'd want to connect all of those, crucifixion, theology, creation, metaphysics, body, soul, anthropology.
So on the creation metaphysics,
Hmm.
you're trying to bring up the point of the dramatic nature of truth,
Hmm.
where like from a lot of a way I've talked about it with Jonathan in the past is that until the crucifixion, you could see in a way the material causes of the
Hmm.
world, like the facts were
Yeah,
there. It wasn't clear what they were pointing to,
yeah,
but they were revealed by the form of the crucifixion. It's like the pattern
yeah,
happened and then reframed history, not just forwards but also backwards.
yeah.
Like the
Right,
so in a way the
right.
world was created. You can say that temporally, like the material causes come first, but
Yeah,
still like in the final cause, in the
yeah,
concept, the more primordial cause, let's say, which is the final
yeah.
cause that happened on the cross, and that's what reframed creation backwards and forwards.
Right, exactly. I mean, that's the lamb slain before the foundation of the world. I mean, that's. I mean, so that I mean, it's again, these things are just breathtaking in their significance, but that's exactly right. Now again, a qualifier there is that I think what you come to see, it's not just that you have matter that then acquires form in the cross, but then that while that's true, then you also realize that in a certain sense, it's revealing something that was already there. And this is part of the retrospective, why it goes back in both directions. Um, so you end up then interpreting um, being in light of the cross and the cross in light of being with a kind of so it's a reciprocity, but it's asymmetrical, so that there's a certain deeper truth to the cross.
Yeah, and like tied up with these arguments is well, this is a tough kind of argument to make because it seems like it doesn't end.
Mhm.
But one of the reasons why Jonathan makes this claim, without often going too deep into the metaphysics, is because he systematically in his works takes the pattern of the incarnation, like centered on the crucifixion, but in general the patterns of the incarnation, and
Yeah,
explains all of creation through that pattern. So
yeah,
it does really look like hidden all over creation are like seeds of the incarnation,
Right,
and
right.
then it comes to its peak in the crucifixion. So all of a
Yeah,
sudden you see like the reason of all creation becomes like unified and coherent into one thing. So it is created by the crucifixion. But it's a tough kind of argument to make to people because it's a cumulative thing. Like you need to be explaining lots and lots of things, and
yeah.
also like without making mistakes, because like a theory can explain everything, but if it makes tons of mistakes with it, then it doesn't work. So I don't know if you have insights on this, like how to communicate that to people.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and this also raises the question of faith and reason, and to what extent is the incarnation a matter of faith? The problem is that we think of faith and reason in competition with each other, and so, you know, reason is what we understand, and then faith is when we take a leap outside of understanding. But that actually thinks of faith and reason in the same level and then opposes them to each other, and that's not how it works. They're not. Their faith is of a radically different order, and so it can include all of reason uh, without short-circuiting anything or compromising anything. So, but at the same time, it's not contained simply in reason.
Yeah.
And that's precisely that, it seems to me, that makes these arguments difficult, because it's not like you can argue your way to the cross. And it'll be interesting to know your background, like how when did this insight finally click for you, and to think of my own experience and to hear it. Jonathan, it'd be interesting because he didn't start out as he had a conversion, as I understand it, right, at a
Yeah.
certain point. And so what is it that that's the interesting question. What triggers that?
Yeah. I don't totally know for Jonathan. I mean, he was brought up evangelical, so I don't
Yeah.
think he ever lost his faith, but
Okay.
it did have a conversion to orthodoxy, which was, I think, dramatically seeing how creation really is part of the logos.
Yeah.
So there was that with him. I think
Right.
in my case, it was like progressively understanding more and more things through the incarnation through Jonathan. But
Yeah.
I'd say like the final steps were like understanding, I'd say, more and more fundamental aspects of creation through the incarnation. And at some point I was like, okay, there's no way there's any better model of reality than
Yeah.
this. So
Yeah. That's right. That's right.
so
Yeah.
it's analog to what I saw also in on my scientific education, because the way you make progress to better models is you first need faith into a new model,
Yeah.
because like initially when you propose something radically new, it's just going to look crazy in your previous metaphysics. So an example I like to give is when Newton introduced gravity, people thought he was crazy because everyone was a mechanist back then, thought that like you need to be pushing or pulling on things.
Right.
So a
Right.
force at a distance was like a crazy magic thing for Newton's contemporaries.
Spooky action at a distance. Yeah.
Yeah, so people needed to grant like a bit of faith towards
Yeah.
Newton's ideas, and then after they did that, then they could get all kinds of insights that they didn't have before, and also without making additional mistakes. So it was just like a pure win to move to Newton's. And
Yeah.
then like when people like and then people sort of forgot that it started on faith,
Yeah.
and now everyone like learns gravity as if it was nothing, and it's just
Yeah. That's right. That's right. Yeah.
so.
If it were yeah. But I mean, do you think that something like that could happen with faith, or do you think, I mean, could it ever be naturalized in that sort of way? That's a really interesting question.
Yeah, I don't know about the details, but I mean, it's also not just an argument. So at some point, you need a. It's not to disentangle because like Jonathan or myself or lots of people who have had this like jump into like full-blown faith at some point. They like you need also to be doing practices to
Yeah. Yeah.
be. But I do think that you can give a pretty succinct. I mean, that's what I try to do in the book. I think
Yeah.
you can give a pretty succinct argument that okay,
Sure.
I'm gonna take like certain very fundamental aspects of creation
Yeah.
and I'm going to give an explanation of them through the incarnation.
Yeah.
Um, I'm going to try to defend also the fact that it's not making huge mistakes.
Yeah.
So it becomes, I think, a very intellectually compelling case, like analog to Newton convincing everyone that gravity was
Right.
actually a thing.
Right. Yeah. No, that, and I mean, and in fact, things that you would think are totally irreconcilable, suddenly you see that they fit together. And that's, even if you're not deducing, I mean, I guess that's exactly your point. It's not that you infer or deduce the unifying point as a conclusion, but you risk the affirmation and then find it confirms itself precisely in bringing things together that wouldn't otherwise seem to fit. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I think I've heard Jonathan talk about faith. I thought it was a good observation that or a good definition. He talks about
Hmm.
faith as like anytime you jump into a higher level. So
Hmm.
let's
Hmm.
say you can have faith in your sports team,
Hmm.
and then like you will accept to see things as if the team existed and act in consequence, and then that's gonna have a downstream effect of actually making you co-heir with the other
Yeah.
members of your team and you like scoring goals. So then your faith is strengthened. So
Yeah.
there's like this ascent of like opening up yourself to like a higher level of reality. But then like if it's real faith and not just a delusion, it's gonna also come back down and solidify things around you and actually like have a causal impact. So it's like
Yeah.
a fractal thing. You can have faith
Yeah.
in higher and higher layers.
That's great. That's wonderful. Yeah. I might steal that idea in my classes. Yeah, no, that's a nice explanation.
That's good. I'm sure Jonathan will be happy to just see the idea spread. Like in your case, did you have also this experience of like how was it for you coming to see the world existing through the cross?
Yeah, it's interesting because I had something very similar to Augustine's experience. Uh, Actually, it was something more analogous initially, oddly, because I this is something I only learned much, 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 much later, but something more similar to the kind of Buddhist non, the a kind of transcendence of suffering that then I came to understand the nature of the good as a kind of metaphysical principle, and I found that absolutely compelling. And then it took years to recognize I mean, I recognize it took years to fully ascend to as well. Um, the incarnation, the good as personal and embodied and entailing a kind of tradition. So, it was in a certain sense, the initial experience was quite a dramatic. I can pinpoint. In fact, I wrote it in a journal, something, a particular day that it all happened when I was in high school. But in another sense, it's something that took many years and it's continuing. But I mean, at this point, even if there are moments of uncertainty about living up to the idea, or I, it is so clearly compelling in terms of history and the meaning of things and how the world works and the nature of form, and I mean everything. Just I can't imagine any more compelling way to explain things. So it's taken the a kind of a fundamental place is perfectly compelling
Yeah.
place.
Very good. I think that's a good place to end it. Maybe as a conclusion, you can give listeners an idea of where they can find your work, what's coming up, what to look forward to.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Let's see. It's funny. I've been working on political philosophy lately, which was not at all what I was interested in. But it was something that I felt compelled to explore because it seemed so important in terms of what was going on in the world. And I think I've done my last probably thing for a while, a book on the nature of authority, which is under review now. So I'll find out in 6, 8 months whether it's going to be published, where it'll be published, I guess. But it's called Authority and Its Counterfeits. And then I'm also finishing up a manuscript that I'm quite excited about right now on gender and sexual difference, a kind of metaphysical account of that, and relationship to culture. So those are the things that are, yeah, recently on the table.
Perfect. Yeah, I recommend everyone check that out. I'll be looking forward to the one on gender. I remember reading your article in Communio on
Okay.
this,
Right.
and finding it very useful to see like how. No, anyway, I don't want to start another
Yeah.
conversation, but I
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
also made use of that in an article I published on the blog. So I'm sure, yeah, I'll be looking forward towards that one. Yeah. So again, everyone, check this out. Thanks again, Dr. Schindler, for coming on.
Well, yeah.
Um,
Thank you for sending me a copy of your book, and And good luck with your project, which really seems eminently valuable.
Thank you.